I mean, I honestly think sometimes the difference between the two parties is a lot less than we think, and a lot of it's more pageantry than it is actual functional reality, and I think they're kind of after some of the same things, and it's all just kind of like we have to have this tete-a-tete in order to create conflict so that we kind of ignore the fact that what's actually going on is we're all sort of being screwed by both parties.
History is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Hoppy Hotdog. Hey guys, just want to start off by saying everyone involved in the show does an excellent job, and I have loved listening for the past couple of years. I believe the reason Roe versus Wade was overturned was because the population growth rate has begun to decline around the entire world, specifically in the U.S. In order for capitalism to work properly, the population must grow constantly at some specific value, because the top 1% or whatever need to have people at the bottom to make money from, and rich people will always find a way to get an abortion if they need it done. The more negative people feel about capitalism, the less votes the Republican Party gets, and I say this as someone who is very middle ground politically and a fan of capitalism. It is in the Republican Party's best interest that people want free market, because that is what gets them votes. This is why I believe that it is the opinion of many of them that we should ban all forms of birth control. Very rare example of politicians cutting into pharmaceutical profits. While I believe abortion should be up to the individual receiving it and probably their spouse if applicable, I do understand the argument from some people that it should be illegal because you're terminating a life. However, I cannot understand the opinion of someone who is willing to take away rights in order to help an ideology or economic system. Would love to hear what you guys think. Thanks, Hoppy Hotdog. Man, some very salient points there that I think we've all thought about and discussed. Specifically, I really appreciated the pointing out of the very rare instance of the Republican Party or just of government in general trying to cut into the profits of pharmaceutical companies. That's pretty. It is very rare, isn't it? Pretty exceedingly
Never
rare.
going to happen. Never going to happen. Birth control is not going to be outright banned on a federal level. It's not going to happen. And you know what? I would not be surprised if a lot of politicians performatively arguing for a move like that also know it's not going to happen. It could happen in maybe some states, right? But I think that would also be short-lived because of the backlash would be involved. I think it's a really interesting point, though, Noel, Poppy, about the idea of growing a population. I want to shout out again that excellent quote about caring about the unborn and then forgetting about them once they have entered the mortal world. You're talking, Poppy, about what is usually called sort of the population replacement rate. This is the fertility rate you need overall to maintain, not necessarily grow, to maintain the size of any given population. And it's a very simple number, 2.1 children per birth-giving person, right? This is the level you need, again, not to grow, but to keep on keeping on. Right now, in the United States, that number is 1.9, which explains what you pointed out earlier, Poppy, why the population is decreasing, right? And we know that there is a pattern that occurs. The pattern is usually this. The more developed and economically successful a country becomes, the lower the birth rate becomes as a rule of thumb. The only issue with this, and I agree with it, I want to hear what you guys think. The only issue with this is that it ascribes a great deal of intelligence and long-term strategic planning to the political class, which typically thinks in terms of 2 to 4 to 6 years timed on election cycles. This is a payout if they are trying to create more people and then naturally to keep those people poor. This is a multi-generational payout, meaning that you might not see the benefits of that plan until well after your political career has ended. And then, of course, the argument, I'm thinking out loud here, the argument against that is that these politicians are pursuing the wishes of their largest donors, right? Of the kingmakers, and business tycoons can wait 18 years.
Maybe. Yeah, I see your point, Ben, but I also think that they're pursuing their own interests. I mean, what happens when your career in politics is over? You're obviously feathering a nest in some way, shape, or form. Whether you do it overtly and brazenly, as some, or it's a little more hidden in the pork, as they say. The things they kind of slip into build. Because I feel like at the end of the day, I mean, all these politicians, no matter how benevolent they may seem, I think some people have a lifelong desire to serve the public and to actually be a valuable member of a lawmaking body, and the desire to help their fellow humans. But I think a lot of times the people that are compelled to do the things that it takes to get to those positions are often not necessarily doing it out of sheer charity. So to me, this argument makes sense, at least, in as much, I'm not saying that Democrats don't like making money too. I mean, I honestly think sometimes the difference between the two parties is a lot less than we think, and a lot of it's more pageantry than it is actual functional reality, and that I think they're kind of after some of the same things. And it's all just kind of like, we have to have this tete-a-tete in order to create conflict, so that we kind of ignore the fact that what's actually going on is we're all sort of being screwed by both parties. But I do see the long game of putting in at least something, while not outright banning abortion, something that will make it more difficult for poorer people to get one, therefore making it more likely that they will have an unwanted pregnancy and an unwanted birth that will then go on to become another poor person that can be exploited much more easily than someone with access to education and who was wanted. I'm not saying that all people of lesser means or lower income tiers are bad parents. That is absolutely not true at all. But it's certainly perpetuating a system that does tend to create folks that are going to grow up to be drones.
Right. One thing that I have learned about doublethink, shout out to Orwell, is that people can become very defensive when their practice of doublethink is pointed out to them. And of course, if you want to make progress with anyone who has an opinion or perspective different from your own, your job is not to talk until you have listened extensively. Listening is one of the most underrated, most important skills of any human interaction. And a lot of people are just terrible at it. I've been terrible at it in the past, but the reason I'm bringing up this mechanic is because the doublethink that often applies here is the idea of not keeping to a continual, consistent definition of pro-life, right? Pro-life, logically, this is just being objective, pro-life would mean not just ensuring that a human is born, but ensuring they are born into a place where they at least get a shot at a life worth living. And to remove their own bodily autonomy, which is uncomfortably adjacent to chattel slavery in that respect, to remove that and then to not follow through on your own self-reported ideology to give those kids a shot at a life worth living means that you are either not thinking through the entirety of what you are purporting to support, or, and I argue this is the case with several politicians, you are purposely misleading people for an ulterior motive. I know that might ruffle some feathers, and I'm not being derogatory nor dismissive of people's ideology. I'm saying an ideology, to be worth practicing, should be consistent in its structure. And in this case, what we're seeing is unfortunately inconsistent and based more on convenience than it is on conviction. I yield my time.
Well, then I take up thine time, sir. In my opinion, I don't think abortion factors in at all to the growing trend of jobs being lost and people finding themselves in a place where they have less and less money. I'm looking at statistics here, looking at the estimated number of abortions that occurred in the United States in, I think, 2019. It's somewhere between 625,000 and 900,000. That's an estimated number. But then if you look at the number of jobs that are being lost at all times due to things like automation, like lower level jobs, right? So somebody who doesn't make a ton of money already, but has a job that gets probably paid hourly and makes enough to almost survive in this crazy economy that we live in, but then losing their jobs due to automation, it's in the millions, and it's only getting higher and higher. Like if you look at something like Leftronic.com, they've got a ton of statistics over here about the number of robots entering the workforce right now. Like 2.5 million that are currently in the workforce. I feel like we are automating ourselves to the same position, the same place economically and from a population standpoint that we're talking about. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not we allow children to be aborted or not, from a government standpoint.
It's a very interesting point, Matt. I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah, I'm gonna have to give it some serious thought.
Unless the plan is to, as you're saying, and as Poppy is maybe speculating, the plan is to not allow that procedure anymore, so that children are forced to be born into not so great situations, so that they're forced to find a job for the haves, right? That would support the haves in some way, because ultimately, when they want. This is my thing. The motivation would be you need somebody who makes enough money to be a proper consumer, right? To buy the things that the corporate owners, that benefits the corporate owners. Because that's what many of us do. We just prop up all these giant corporations by buying their stuff all the time, nonstop.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying, and I'm going to speak on behalf of our fellow listeners, some of whom are shouting at their speakers or their their phones right now by saying this concept of an ulterior motive is that bears a lot of similarity to the argument that certain economic conditions have been tweaked to maintain a ready population of young poor people with no alternative for success other than joining the military. I would say that given what we know about the human brain and given what we know about the way people tend to react when creating plans, it is entirely plausible that what happened was a kind of feedback loop or slippery slope, whichever analogy you prefer, where one thing changed for short-term benefit, and then there was a domino effect, since we're just throwing out analogies, which meant that, like, let's say someone knows they're going to make a killing off instituting student loans, right? One of the most usurious things happening in the U.S. outside of privatized healthcare. And now everybody else who makes a plan on a large scale, on a macro scale, they're not starting from square one. They're starting from square two. The reality of the field has changed. And then it continues as people keep making new plans off a differing baseline. And toward the end, at some threshold, what happens begins to look like, from far away, a very well thought out and coordinated conspiracy. When the truth is, it's just very smart and, not super ethical people reacting to the creations of other people. That I think, I don't know the answer, folks, but I would say that we have to acknowledge that sometimes there's just no one at the wheel. There are many groups who want to be, but there's not one shadowy cabal just yet. Still, it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. Removing bodily autonomy in almost any regard is a step towards slavery. That's my opinion.